Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On October 14, 2013, an American student got off at Kawaguchiko Station in Japan. She didn't have a return ticket, but she wasn't going to stay here forever either. Her goal was the Aokigahara Forest, a place notorious for being the sea of trees, where people often disappear at will. But Sydney Johnson was not looking for death. She was looking for beauty in the darkness, armed only with a professional camera and the ambition of a photographer. She entered the woods at 10 in the morning, and that was the last time she was seen free. What will be found 7 days later in the thicket will not be like a normal disappearance. It will be an installation of living pain, fixed in eternity with red ropes. On October 14, 2013, at 8:45 in the morning, CCTV cameras at the Kawaguchiko railway station recorded the arrival of a train heading from Tokyo. Among the morning crowd of mostly local residents and groups of Asian tourists, the lens caught the figure of a young, European-looking girl. It was Sydney Johnson, a 21-year-old student from Seattle. She was wearing a bright yellow jacket that would later become the main landmark for search teams, dark jeans, and professional hiking boots. Her gait was confident, and her face showed neither anxiety nor depression, which was in stark contrast to the typical psychological portrait of people who come to this region with fatal intentions. At 9:15, Sydney approached the automatic luggage storage area in the west wing of the station. According to the security system logs, she paid for the rental of cell number 304. She left her main luggage there, a large blue hiking backpack, taking only the essentials for a one-day outing. A professional Canon 5DI Mark III DSLR camera, 2 interchangeable lenses for macro and panoramic photography, a detailed paper map of the area, and a liter bottle of water. She checked the battery charge, took a test shot of the station square through the glass doors, and headed for the bus platform. The driver of the Psycho Line bus, also known among tourists as the Green Line, would later give a detailed statement to the police. According to him, the foreigner boarded the bus at 9:30. The cabin was half empty. Sydney took a seat near the window on the left side and kept her camera in her hand all the way, taking pictures of the rapidly changing scenery, foggy mountain slopes and dense forests approaching the road. She got off at the Fugaku Wind Cave bus stop at exactly 10:15. This location is a popular tourist spot and serves as one of the main, controlled entrances to the Aokigahara Forest. The Aokigahara Forest, located at the northwestern foot of Mount Fuji, has a unique geological structure. There is virtually no soil here. The trees grow directly on the frozen volcanic rock, left over from the 864th eruption. The lava, covered with a thick layer of moss, forms a porous landscape that absorbs sounds, creating an unnatural, oppressive silence. The roots of the trees do not go deep, but snake across the surface, creating a complex maze. Sydney Johnson came here to capture the contrast between this gloomy reputation of the Sea of Trees and its visual aesthetic. At 10:30, she was spotted by an elderly couple of hikers at the entrance to the official trail. The man, Mr. Takeshi, said during the interview that the girl greeted them in Japanese. He remembered her enthusiasm. She kept looking up at the tangle of crowns and adjusting the focus of her camera. According to witnesses, Sydney initially followed the marked route, but at the fork leading to the Wild Bird Trail, she deliberately turned sideways, into an area not fenced off by ropes. That was the last time Sydney Johnson was seen. According to the rules of the Case House Mount Fuji hostel, where Sydney had booked a bed in a dormitory room, check-in was to take place by 21 o'clock. The receptionist, Yuki Nakamura, who was used to the meticulousness of her guests, began to worry when the room was still empty at 22 o'clock. She tried to call the American number listed in the booking form. The call went through, but immediately switched to voicemail. Yuki left a message but did not raise the alarm that night, assuming that the tourist might have been delayed in another city or had communication problems, which is common in mountainous areas. The morning of October 15, 2013, brought confirmation of the worst fears. Sydney did not get in touch and did not return to spend the night. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the hostel administration officially notified the Yamanashi Prefectural Police of the disappearance of a person. Given the specifics of Aokigahara, The officer on duty initially classified it as a potential suicide, a standard procedure for this region, where dozens of bodies are found every year. However, this version began to fall apart within an hour when detectives contacted the family of the missing person in Seattle. Sydney's brother, Michael Johnson, testified via video link. He categorically denied the possibility of suicide. Michael said that he spoke with his sister on the evening of October 13th. She was in high spirits, describing in detail her plans to shoot chiaroscuro on lava fields and discussing her upcoming visit to Kyoto the following week. Sydney was living her project and showed no signs of depression. This evidence led the police to reclassify the case as a search and rescue operation. At 14 o'clock on October 15th, a mobile headquarters was deployed in the parking lot near the Wind Cave. 12 police officers and a group of 6 experienced volunteers from the Forest Patrol organization were involved in the operation. The operation was led by Lieutenant Kenji Sato. The search area was defined as a 2-mile radius from the point of last visual contact. The search team entered the forest in a chain, keeping a distance of 15 feet from each other. The conditions were difficult. The volcanic rock underfoot was unstable and fragile, hiding deep cavities under a layer of moss where a foot or even a whole person could easily fall through. Another problem was magnetic anomalies. Iron deposits in the lava caused compasses to rotate randomly, making traditional navigation impossible. The group relied only on visual landmarks and radio communication, which was intermittent due to the density of the forest. At 15 hours and 40 minutes, one of the volunteers discovered a clear tread print on soft ground, 300 yards off the main trail. A forensic expert confirmed that the tread pattern matched the type of hiking shoe Sydney was wearing. The tracks led to the northwest, deep into what the locals call the Green Chaos area, an area where the terrain becomes rugged, and the trees grow so dense that even during the day, it is dark. The tracks were fragmentary. Sydney obviously stopped often, changed direction, looking for the best angle for a photo. Half a mile from the first footprint, the chain of prints broke on a wide plateau of hardened lava, where the stone does not retain traces. The sun began to set behind Mount Fuji at 17 hours and 20 minutes. The air temperature dropped rapidly, approaching 5 degrees Celsius. At dusk, Aokigahara changed. The shadows lengthened, and the silence became absolute, absorbing even the sound of footsteps. Lieutenant Sato realized that continuing the search in the dark without special lighting in such an area was an unjustified risk to the rescuers' lives. Any mistake could lead to a fall into a lava crack. At 18 o'clock, the order came to stop the active phase of the search until dawn. The group returned to the headquarters in silence. They combed the forest for 4 hours, but found nothing but a few boot prints. Not a piece of clothing, not a lost lens cap, not a bottle of water. The forest simply swallowed the girl. When the last beam of the flashlight disappeared around a bend in the trail, darkness fell in the thicket where the searchers had not reached, hiding the fact that Sydney Johnson was much closer to them than they could have imagined, but no longer within reach of help. October 21st, 2013, marked the 7th day since Sydney Johnson disappeared. In search and rescue operations, this timeline is often referred to as the point of no return. The statistics of survival in the Aokigahara forest without special equipment after a week's stay is close to 0. Nighttime temperatures in mid-October dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and high humidity turned the cold into a fatal factor, even for a physically fit person. Hopes of finding the American student alive in official police reports were replaced by the phrase, "search for a body." Although the large-scale police operation was formally curtailed, the work continued with the Forest Patrol, a non-governmental organization. This is a group of local volunteers who have been searching for decades for those who have decided to stay in the forest forever. Their tactics are different from the police. They do not walk in chains, but work in small groups of 2 or 3, checking the most remote and inaccessible sectors where tourists rarely set foot. At 10 o'clock and 40 minutes in the morning, a group of 3 volunteers led by 50-year veteran searcher Hiroshi Tanaka entered a closed sector of the forest, located south of the old abandoned road leading to Lake Shoji. This area is considered one of the most dangerous due to the high concentration of magnetic anomalies and deep lava cracks hidden under a layer of rotten leaves. The group moved slowly, overcoming dense undergrowth. In 3 hours of work, they walked about 2 miles from the nearest paved surface. At 13 hours and 15 minutes, Hiroshi Tanaka noticed something unnatural down below, in a deep geological depression surrounded by centuries-old trees. Tanaka's testimony, later recorded in a police report, describes the moment dryly, but with terrifying detail. "I saw a bright red spot among the gray-green trunks. At first I thought it was someone's abandoned jacket or tent, but the color was too saturated, unnatural for hiking gear. It looked like blood frozen in the air." The volunteers went down the slope into the lowlands. What they saw made them stop 20 feet away from the site. It was not a pile of garbage or a body lying on the ground. Sydney Johnson was standing upright. Her back was pressed against the massive trunk of a Japanese cypress tree, known as a hinoki. Her feet did not touch the ground. They were hanging a few inches above the tangle of roots, but visually it appeared that she was standing. The girl was transformed into a part of the tree. Her body from the neck to the ankles was tightly wrapped in thick red jute ropes. It was not a chaotic binding. The ropes lay in perfect symmetrical patterns, creating a complex geometric grid over her dirty yellow jacket and jeans. The technique was reminiscent of the Japanese art of shibari, but it lacked any aesthetic of play. The knots were tightened with manic brutality. The ropes dug deep into the fabric of the clothes, deforming the down jacket, and fixed every joint of the girl so that she could not move even a finger. Sydney's arms were bent at the elbows and pressed to her chest, her palms folded together, imitating a prayer pose. A red thread passed between each finger, fixing this gesture tightly. Her head was tilted slightly forward, her long hair tangled and partially hidden under the coils of rope covering her forehead. The volunteers approached cautiously, expecting to see a corpse. The girl's eyes were wide open and staring at one point, at the moss at the roots. She did not react to the approach of people, to the sound of voices, to the crunch of branches. She was in a state of deep, catatonic stupor. When Tanaka checked her pulse on her carotid artery, he felt a faint but rhythmic beat. Sydney was alive. Her skin was pale and cold to the touch, showing signs of severe hypothermia. However, one detail stood out from the overall picture of exhaustion. Her lips were not chapped from dehydration, as is usually the case after a week in the woods without water. There were traces of moisture in the corners of her mouth. Someone had eaten her. Someone had come to this tree to keep it alive in this horrific installation. There were no personal belongings around the tree, within a radius of 50 feet. Not a big hiking backpack, not an expensive camera, not a bottle of water, just a girl, red ropes, and a tree. It seemed that she was not just captured, but exhibited as an exhibit in a museum of silence. Volunteers immediately called a rescue helicopter, but the dense tree crown made it impossible to evacuate from the air. They had to wait for a group of medics to safely cut the ropes. Each layer of rope cut revealed the horrifying truth about how professionally and ruthlessly the body had been immobilized. Sydney did not make a sound when the pressure of the ropes disappeared. She simply fell into the arms of the rescuers, maintaining the same frozen pose in which she had been shackled by the unknown master. At 15 hours 40 minutes, Sydney Johnson was carried out of the forest on a stretcher to an ambulance. She was breathing, but her consciousness was far away. The police officers who arrived at the crime scene looked at the cut red ropes lying in a pile near the roots of the cypress tree. This was no ordinary kidnapping for ransom or violence. It was an act of turning a person into an object, and whoever did it left no fingerprints, only hundreds of yards of red jute and a silent question hanging in the cold air. If he kept her alive, why? Friends, before we continue to unravel this tangle of gruesome events, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave any comments. It will only take you a few seconds, but it is critically important for YouTube's algorithms. It's your activity that helps to promote this kind of content so that more people can learn about these intricate stories. Thank you for your support. And now, let's get back to the investigation. On October 21st, 2013, at 18 hours and 15 minutes, an ambulance brought Sydney Johnson to the emergency room of the Red Cross Hospital in Kawaguchiko. The medical staff on duty that night later described the patient's condition as critically stable but psychologically devastated. She was conscious but unresponsive to doctors' commands, remaining in the same position in which she was found in the forest, her arms bent at the elbows, as if pressed to an invisible prayer book. Her muscles had hardened due to prolonged immobility, and the medics had to make considerable effort to gently unbend her limbs for examination. The initial diagnosis recorded in the medical record was disappointing: deep second-degree hypothermia, severe dehydration, and exhaustion. However, it was not the general indicators that caused the most concern, but the localized injuries. The girl's body was covered with deep crimson furrows, traces of ropes that had cut into the skin through her clothes. A neurologist diagnosed multiple compression neuropathy. The nerve endings in her arms and legs were so long compressed that Sydney temporarily lost sensation in her fingers. This indicated that she had been in this condition for days, not hours. Her blood circulation was maintained at a minimum level, sufficient for survival, but not enough for the full functioning of her limbs. The next morning, October 22, Police Lieutenant Kenji Sato arrived at the intensive care unit. He hoped to get at least some testimony that could shed light on the identity of the kidnapper. However, the attempted interrogation ended before it even began. Sydney lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling with a blank, glassy gaze. She did not respond to her name, did not blink when a hand was held in front of her face. The incident that occurred during the detective's visit made the depth of her trauma clear. When the nurse tried to adjust the IV, the clear plastic tube accidentally touched Sydney's shoulder. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The girl did not scream. She shrank into a ball. Her body began to shake with small, uncontrollable tremors, and her breathing became shallow and shallow. Her eyes were fixed on the tube with animalistic terror. The visiting psychiatrist, Dr. Takeda, after observing the patient, diagnosed severe post-traumatic stress disorder with manifestations of dissociative amnesia. This is a defense mechanism of the brain that turns off memories of unbearable pain or horror to save the mind from complete disintegration. Sydney was afraid of any long, flexible objects, monitor cables, blind cords, even her own hair if it touched her neck. She became silent, locking herself in her own internal prison, the keys to which remained somewhere in the Aokigahara forest. While doctors fought for the victim's psyche, forensic scientists at the Yamanashi Prefectural Laboratory focused on the only indisputable evidence: the ropes. The ropes cut from the girl's body were delivered in duffel bags, numbered and sealed. The total length of the seized material was over 300 feet. It was not ordinary household twine that can be bought at any hardware store. Examination of the material showed that it was high-quality jute, hand-dyed with natural pigments in a deep red color. The fiber structure was soft, treated with special oils that prevent rotting and reduce friction against the skin. This material is used in two specific areas: traditional religious Shinto ceremonies, or in elite private clubs that practice the art of shibari, or Japanese erotic binding. The cost of such a quantity of prepared jute reached hundreds of dollars, which completely excluded the version of a spontaneous attack by a homeless person or a random maniac. The knots themselves provided even more information. A forensic expert involved in the case identified the main pattern as a kiko, a tortoiseshell knot. In classic shibari, this pattern is used to aesthetically fix the torso, creating a beautiful geometry on the model's body. However, in this case, the technique was distorted. The person who knitted Sydney knew the rules, but deliberately violated the most important one: safety. The knots were tightened with manic, surgical precision and cruelty. Each turn of the rope was designed to limit mobility as much as possible, but not to completely block breathing. This was not the work of an amateur learning from pictures on the internet. It was the handwriting of a master, a person with years of practice, who has perfect motor skills and an understanding of anatomy. The attacker did not just tie up the victim. He spent hours methodically braiding her body, turning a living person into a stationary art object. Detective Sato, looking at the photographs of the knots under a microscope, realized a terrible thing. The complexity of the pattern indicated that the perpetrator had spent a long time with Sydney. He was calm, focused, and confident in his impunity. In the woods, where people usually get lost and die alone, someone acted who felt like a master there. And judging by the level of preparation, Sydney Johnson was not his first canvas, but just another stage in a horrific gallery whose exhibits the police have not even begun to find. On October 23, 2013, the investigation into the case of Sydney Johnson entered a new, more threatening phase. Experts' conclusions about the professionalism of the knots and the specifics of red jute left no doubt. The criminal had not just escaped, he was probably still somewhere within the forest, which he knew better than any ranger. Aokigahara ceased to be a place of passive sadness and turned into a territory of active hunting. Lieutenant Kenji Sato decided to re-examine the crime scene, this time with the utmost care that the volunteers could not provide during the rescue operation. At 9 o'clock in the morning, a group of 4 forensic scientists and 2 detectives arrived in the sector where the girl was found. The terrain was extremely difficult to move through. Hardened lava formed ridges, sharp as broken glass, hidden under a deceptively soft carpet of moss. Every step required checking the ground with a probe, as there could be deep cavities underfoot. The silence was absolute, and this created an oppressive atmosphere. It seemed that the forest was watching every move of the police officers. The group's task was to expand the search radius for physical evidence. They moved in a spiral away from Sydney's tree, methodically inspecting every cavity and crack. At 10 o'clock 45 minutes, one of the forensic scientists gave a signal. About 160 feet from the cypress tree where the victim was tied, something glinted in a narrow rock crevice. It was a camera. It was a professional Canon 5DI Mark III DSLR with an expensive wide-angle lens. But what struck the detectives the most was not the fact that the expensive equipment was lying in the middle of the forest, but the way it was lying. The camera hadn't been thrown in a hurry. It had no signs of falling or being hit. It was carefully placed on a flat, lichen-covered boulder that served as an improvised tripod. The lens was clearly pointed toward the same tree where Sydney had been found tied up 2 days earlier. This detail changed the psychological portrait of the perpetrator. He did not take the equipment as a trophy or destroy it to hide the evidence. He left it as an eye, as a mute witness to his work. It was as if he wanted the camera to look at his creation, even when he was not there. This indicated narcissism and complete confidence in his own elusiveness. The camera was placed in a sterile container and rushed to a digital forensics laboratory in Kofu. At 14 o'clock, the engineers removed the compact flash memory card. The media contained more than 800 images. The initial review of the content allowed detectives to restore the chronology of that fateful day, looking at the world through the eyes of the victim. The first part of the images, taken between 10:30 and 12 o'clock on October 14, was full of aesthetics. These were highly artistic shots. The play of light on the roots of trees, macro shots of dewdrops on moss, majestic panoramas of intertwined crowns. The photos confirmed what Sydney's brother had said. She was fascinated by the beauty of nature, looking for harmony and peace. The shots were stable, compositionally balanced, with the right exposure settings. But then, in the picture with the time code 12 hours, 42 minutes, everything changed dramatically. This shot was the first in a series that experts called chaos. The horizon in the photo was off by 45 degrees. The image was blurry and out of focus. The next 20 shots were taken in burst mode, probably by accident, as Sydney's finger convulsed on the shutter release button. It was a chronicle of a panicked escape. The camera, hanging around the girl's neck on a long strap, randomly hit her in the chest as she ran. The lens captured only blurry spots, gray volcanic earth, flashing tree trunks, a piece of sky crossed by black branches. In one of the shots, a part of her own hand could be seen in the corner, desperately trying to grab air or protect herself from falling. Metadata analysis showed that the chase lasted about 7 minutes. Then there was a long pause of several hours, during which the camera was probably turned off or in standby mode. The last frame on the memory card became the most important evidence in the case. It was taken at 18 hours and 15 minutes, when it was already pitch black in the forest. The picture was taken using a built-in flash, which indicated who had pressed the button. Sydney never used a direct flash for artistic photos. It was the handwriting of a person who wanted to illuminate the space in front of them or capture a moment of fear. The shot was overexposed in the foreground and faded to black in the background, but digital processing allowed us to bring out the details. In the center of the composition, distorted by harsh light and shadows, was the man's face. He was very close to the lens, perhaps leaning over the camera or holding it in his hands. The facial features were blurred by the movement, transformed into a horrifying mask, dilated pupils reflecting the light of the flash, tense neck muscles, and a mouth open in a grimace. It was almost impossible to identify the person in this photo, but it gave an idea of his emotional state, whether it was a state of ecstasy or rage. However, the most valuable information was hidden in the background, in the depths of the frame, where the flashlight barely reached. It was not a forest. Behind the man's back, rough-hewn wooden beams, typical of old outbuildings, and massive shelves were visible. On the shelves were rows of glass jars of various sizes. The contents of the jars looked black in the photo, but spectral color analysis showed that the substance inside was actually a deep dark red hue. Looking at the enlarged fragment of the photo on the monitor, Lieutenant Sato felt a chill run down his spine. The red cans, combined with the red ropes on Sydney's body, formed a single picture. The criminal hadn't brought the jute with him in his backpack. He made it here. Somewhere in the depths of Aokigahara's no-go zone, hidden from the eyes of tourists and police, there was a building, a workshop where he boiled his paints and prepared tools for turning people into statues. And judging by the interior in the photo, this place was very close by. On October 24, 2013, at 8 o'clock in the morning, the atmosphere in Lieutenant Kenji Sato's office at the Yamanashi Prefectural Police Department was tense. On the desk were printed out, maximally illuminated images recovered from Sydney Johnson's camera. The last picture, taken with a flash in the dark, was subjected to a close analysis by a group of architects and historians involved in the investigation as consultants. The experts drew attention to a specific detail of the interior that had previously gone unnoticed. The wooden floor beams that were captured above the unidentified man's head had characteristic carpentry joints used in industrial construction in the mid-20th century. This was neither a residential building nor a tourist shelter. Massive shelves lined with cans and sooty marks on the walls indicated that the room had been used to work with chemicals or high temperatures. At 9 o'clock 15 minutes, Lieutenant Sato arrived at the Fuji Kawaguchiko County Forestry Archives. He was interested in records of any industrial facilities that had operated deep in the Aokigahara forest before it was granted national park status. It took over 3 hours to work with paper maps from the 60s and 80s. At 11 o'clock 40 minutes, the archivist found a yellowed folder with the registration number 784. The documents listed an enterprise called Saito Timber Depot. It was a private workshop for the processing of precious wood and the production of natural dyes, founded in the 80s of the last century. The owner, a craftsman named Ichiro Saito, was engaged in the manufacture of traditional lacquered products using specific techniques for cooking bark and roots. According to the documents, the company went bankrupt and was officially closed in 1998 after the owner's death. The building was located in the G4 sector, southwest of the popular tourist destination of Narasawa Ice Cave, but much deeper in the forest, about 3.5 miles from the nearest paved road. This area has a bad reputation, even among foresters. Geologists classify it as a high-risk landslide zone. Under the thin layer of soil there are old lava tunnels, the vaults of which are thinning over time. Because of the danger of collapse, the area was officially closed to the public in 2001, and all the paths leading to the old depot were deliberately dug up or blocked by a boulder to discourage tourists. At 13 hours and 20 minutes, the detectives interviewed a group of local stalkers, industrial tourism enthusiasts who often violate prohibitions and enter closed areas of the forest. One of them, a 20-year-old student who wished to remain anonymous, provided important evidence. He said that 2 months ago, during a nighttime foray into the area of an old sawmill, he saw a faint, flickering light in the windows of an abandoned building. It didn't look like a security guard's flashlight, the witness said. The light was dim, yellowish, as if from candles or a kerosene lamp. We thought that Yakuza members or ghosts were hiding there, so we didn't dare to get closer and ran away. We didn't tell anyone about it because we were there illegally. These words confirmed Sato's hunch. The Saito Timber Depot was not abandoned. Someone had inhabited the ruins, using people's fear of the forest and official bans as a perfect cover for their activities. Meanwhile, at 14 hours and 30 minutes, an event occurred at the Red Cross Hospital that finally tied all the threads of the investigation into one knot. The nurse on duty urgently called Dr. Takeda to the intensive care unit. Sydney Johnson, who had previously been in a state of complete detachment, became active for the first time. She was sitting on the bed, rocking back and forth violently. Her eyes were no longer empty. They showed panic mixed with an attempt to remember something. She was clutching the pencil her psychiatrist had left her for art therapy. On a sheet of paper brought by a nurse, Sydney tried to draw something with chaotic, jagged movements. When Dr. Takeda came closer, he saw that it was not just a scribble. In the center of the sheet was one short word, written in Latin but in Japanese. Aka. Translated, it means red. Below the word, the girl's trembling hand drew a complex diagram. It was an interweaving of lines that formed a clear geometric pattern, a hexagon. The doctor, who had a basic knowledge of the culture, recognized the drawing as a stylized turtle shell pattern, the same Kiko knot that had tied the victim. But the most important thing was what Sydney whispered to the doctor at the moment of enlightenment. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible through her dry throat. She did not recall her attacker's face, voice, or clothing. Her memory, working on the principle of associations, brought to the surface the strongest sensory trigger, the smell. Earth, she whispered, looking through the doctor. Damp earth and a solvent, caustic, like paint. It smelled like a garage. These words were instantly passed on to Lieutenant Sato. The puzzle was complete. The smell of the chemical solvent that the victim recalled perfectly matched the profile of the Saito Timber Depot workshop. To make the durable dyes that were impregnated in the ropes, specific fixatives and solvents with a pungent odor are needed. Sydney was kept there, in the old dyer's shack, where red was not just a decorative color, but the basis of all production. At 15 hours 45 minutes, Sato called an emergency meeting. The location was set. It was an isolated building in the emergency zone, surrounded by lava crack traps. Whoever was hiding there knew the police were coming even before they set foot on the trail, because the forest around them served as a natural alarm. The question was not whether there was someone in that hut, but what exactly he was preparing for the intruders in his red lair. On October 25, 2013, the investigation into the kidnapping of Sydney Johnson received the key element it had been missing, a name. A forensic analysis of the unique red jute found on the victim's body led detectives to a specialty shop in the Shinjuku district of Tokyo. The shop owner, after reviewing the order archive, remembered a customer who had purchased a bulk shipment of raw fiber and specific chemical dyes 3 years ago. His name was Hiroshi Tanaka. After receiving this name, Lieutenant Kenji Sato made a request to the Metropolitan Police database. The dossier, which arrived by fax at 10:30, painted a portrait of a man whose occupational deformity had turned into a dangerous pathology. Hiroshi Tanaka, a 45-year-old native of Tokyo, spent most of his life working as a stage rigger in large theaters. He was responsible for the complex mechanisms of lifting scenery and actors, knowing the physics of knots and weight distribution perfectly. However, his colleagues knew him from a different angle. In his spare time, Tanaka was an active member of closed communities practicing shibari, the Japanese art of erotic binding. However, even in this environment, where the pain threshold is a matter of agreement, Tanaka became an outcast. 3 years ago, he was permanently expelled from the Red Lotus Club. The reason was not just cruelty, but a complete disregard for the safety and will of his partner. Witnesses to those events said that Hiroshi was obsessed with the idea of static beauty. He did not perceive the model as a living person who breathes and feels pain. For him, it was just material to be captured in a perfect pose forever. He called it absolute peace. After being expelled and fired from the theater, Tanaka disappeared. His apartment in Tokyo was empty, and his bills were not paid. Investigating psychologists, analyzing his profile, concluded that he had transferred his philosophy to a larger canvas. For a man seeking to stop decay and chaos, the Aokigahara forest was the perfect place. In his distorted perception, it was a place where people disintegrate physically and morally, and his mission was to reassemble them, give them form, and capture their beauty before it was destroyed by decay. At 12:15, a combined Yamanashi Prefectural Police Unit and a special assault team moved deep into the forest, targeting the abandoned Saito Timber Depot workshop identified in the victim's camera photos. They had to move in radio silence, avoiding known tourist routes so as not to scare the suspect. The workshop building emerged from the fog at 14 o'clock. It was a gloomy, one-story structure made of blackened wood that almost completely merged with the surrounding forest. The roof was overgrown with a thick layer of moss, and young fern shoots were poking through the rotten boards. The windows were boarded up with plywood from the inside, turning the house into a blind box. There was dead silence around, not even the wind rustled in the treetops. The capture team surrounded the perimeter. At Lieutenant Sato's command, the assault team kicked in the front door. They expected to see resistance, traps, or Tanaka himself with a weapon. But what was revealed to them in the beams of tactical flashlights made even the hardened officers lower their weapons in surprise. The interior of the workshop was transformed into a surreal installation. It was neither a dwelling nor a workshop. It was a temple of madness. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of red ropes hung from the ceiling beams, 10 feet high. They intertwined with each other, creating a complex, multi-layered web that filled almost the entire volume of the room. The rays of the lanterns snatched up geometric shapes, loops, and knots of incredible complexity in this labyrinth. The air in the room was heavy, saturated with the smell of chemical solvent, rotted wood, and something sweet, like incense. In the center of the room stood large vats of dark liquid, the same ones that Sydney's camera had captured. New batches of jute were being soaked in them, preparing to become part of this endless network. But the worst was waiting on the walls. The entire far wall of the workshop was turned into a gallery of voyeurism. It was densely covered with photographs printed on a conventional printer. There were dozens of them. The pictures, taken with a powerful telephoto lens, depicted people. Casual tourists walking along forest paths, couples in love taking pictures near caves, loners sitting on fallen trees in thought. The detectives were horrified to recognize Sydney Johnson in some of the photos. Here she is getting off the bus. Here she is adjusting her backpack. Here she is looking at the map. Tanaka had been following her from the very beginning, studying her movements, her plasticity, evaluating her as material for his work. She was not a random victim. She was a chosen project. But Sydney was not alone. On the wall hung photographs of other people taken at different times of the year. Some of the pictures dated back to 2011. Most of these people had probably just gone home, not even realizing that a maniac was watching them through the lens, imagining them in their red shackles. But there were other photos as well, pictures of empty spaces in the forest, bizarrely shaped trees, and depressions in the lava. These shots looked like sketches, like a fitting for a future composition. Hiroshi Tanaka himself was not in the building. His bed, an old mattress in the corner, was cold. On the table, littered with sketches of knots and diagrams of human anatomy, was a cup of half-drunk tea, on the surface of which a film of mold had already formed. This showed that the owner had left his lair not an hour or two ago. He had left calmly, without running away, taking only the most valuable things with him, his tools. Lieutenant Sato walked over to his desk and noticed something that made his heart sink. In the middle of the chaos of papers was a map of the Aokigahara forest. It was dotted with red markers. Some points were crossed out with a cross, like the place where Sydney was found. Others were simply circled. The detective counted 7 such circles in the deepest parts of the forest. Sydney Johnson was the first to be found alive, but she was not the first person Tanaka decided to save. At that moment, the radio of one of the commandos came to life. The voice of the observer left outside trembled with tension. "Commander, we have movement on the perimeter. Northern sector, near the old ventilation shafts. Someone just cut a tripwire, but didn't blow up." He knew it was there. Sato understood. Tanaka had not escaped. He was here, in his forest, and he was watching the police destroy his temple, waiting for the moment to make his last, most perfect knot. On October 25, 2013, at 16 hours and 30 minutes, a special police assault team completed the perimeter of the Saito Timber Depot workshop. The building was empty. Hiroshi Tanaka had left his hideout, but he had left behind something more important than his physical presence: his thoughts. On a dusty table, next to the drawings of the knots, the detectives found a thick, leather-bound notebook. It was a diary that Tanaka had been keeping for the past 3 years. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, flipping through the pages with gloves on, plunged into the abyss of twisted logic. The notes contained no remorse or fear of the law. It was the manifesto of a psychopathic artist. The last entry, dated the morning of the same day, explained everything. Tanaka was not going to kill Sydney Johnson in the usual sense of the word. In his mind, he was saving her. She was too alive for this dead world, Tanaka wrote in his smooth calligraphic handwriting. The forest wanted to take her, break her down into atoms, turn her into dung. I stopped her time. I packed her into a cocoon of eternity. She became part of the forest, but remained beautiful. Those who cut my fetters are barbarians. They did not save the girl. They destroyed the masterpiece. They insulted my gift. These lines made it clear. Tanaka is not running away to hide. He is looking for a place where he can complete his last performance, which no one can interrupt. At 17 o'clock, a dog handler with a search dog reported a trail. The dog led the group not towards the road or settlements, but even deeper into the forest, towards Lake Psycho. This part of the forest is known for its lava tunnels, natural cavities formed during a volcanic eruption. Most of them, such as the famous Bat Cave, are tourist attractions equipped with handrails and lighting. However, the trail led to the Wild Zone, where the entrances to the dungeons look like inconspicuous holes in the ground, hidden by tree roots. At 17 hours and 45 minutes, the Yamanashi Prefectural Police blocked traffic on National Highway 139. It was an unprecedented decision that caused miles of traffic jams, but Sato couldn't take any chances. The tunnels in this area often run right under the road, and any vibration could cause a collapse or give the criminal an escape route through the drainage systems. The area was surrounded by a double cordon of security. At 18 hours and 10 minutes, a SWAT team led by Sato approached a narrow dip in the ground, camouflaged by dense shrubbery. The entrance to the cave was no wider than 3 feet. The hole was filled with a grave cold and a faint but recognizable odor, a mixture of damp earth and the same chemical solvent. Tanaka was there. The descent into the lava tunnel was like a plunge into hell. The walls of the cave were covered with razor-sharp protrusions of frozen magma. The height of the vault ranged from 10 feet to 2, forcing the special forces to crawl like scouts. Absolute darkness reigned here, cut only by the beams of tactical flashlights. The sound of breathing in the confined space seemed deafening. The group moved 100 yards deeper when the tunnel expanded into a large, natural hall. In the center of this hall, in the beams of lanterns, a scene worthy of the worst nightmares opened up. Hiroshi Tanaka was kneeling in front of a tall limestone stalagmite. He was dressed in a black work jumpsuit. Tools were laid out around him: scissors, skeins of red jute, and special curved knives for cutting ropes. He was not holding a firearm and did not try to attack the police. He was busy working on himself. Tanaka was methodically wrapping a thick red rope around his own neck, the end of which was already securely fastened to the top of the stalagmite. He was creating the same intricate knot design that he had used on Sydney earlier. This was not a quick suicide attempt. It was a ritual. He tightened the nooses slowly, checking the tension of each turn, trying to turn his own death into an act of art. His face was calm, focused, as if he were tying a tie in front of a mirror, not a noose in a dungeon. "Police! Hands up!" The shout of the assault team leader echoed off the stone walls. Tanaka did not even flinch. He continued to move, tightening the final knot under his chin. His hands moved with amazing precision. Sato realized that if they didn't intervene right now, the suspect would simply cut off his carotid arteries and lose consciousness in seconds, completing his plan. "Take him alive!" the lieutenant ordered. The 2 officers rushed forward. When Tanaka saw them, he showed emotion for the first time. He grabbed one of the rope-cutting knives lying nearby, but instead of rushing at the police, he put the blade to the stretched rope, threatening to jerk his head and cause a fatal injury to his neck vertebrae. "Stay away from me!" His voice broke into a hysterical scream that cut through the cave's acoustics. "You don't understand anything. You're barbarians. You've already ruined one job. I won't let you ruin the finale." The commando who was closest to him used a stun gun. The 50,000-volt discharge hit Tanaka in the shoulder. His body arched, and the knife fell out of his hands, clinking against the stones. The officers instantly threw him to the ground, pressing his face against the cold lava. The detention was harsh. Tanaka resisted with superhuman strength, despite the effects of the current. He tried not to hit the police, but to reach with his teeth to the rope around his neck to tighten it. They handcuffed his wrists, but he kept screaming. It was not cursing or begging for mercy. "The composition," he wailed as he was dragged to the exit of the tunnel. "You have destroyed the composition. It was supposed to be eternal. Red on black. You've ruined everything." His screams subsided only when the group was brought to the surface, where they were greeted by spotlights and the sound of walkie-talkies. The medics rushed to examine the detainee, trying to remove a complex system of knots from his neck. Sato looked on and realized that they had physically captured the criminal, but the victory had a taste of defeat. Tanaka looked at them not as representatives of the law, but as vandals who broke into the gallery and cut up the paintings. And in his crazed gaze, there was something that made the lieutenant shudder, the confidence that his art would still outlast them all. On November 5, 2013, the Yamanashi Prefectural Prosecutor's Office officially indicted Hiroshi Tanaka. He was charged with kidnapping, inflicting grievous bodily harm, and unlawful imprisonment. However, as investigators delved into the details of the diaries found in the cave and analyzed hundreds of photographs from the walls of the workshop, the charge began to change. Tanaka was not just a kidnapper. He was a serial criminal who had been operating in the shadow of Mount Fuji for at least 3 years. The interrogations, whose protocols later became part of the closed police archive, revealed the former rigger's terrifying philosophy. Tanaka behaved calmly, even aloofly. He did not deny what he had done, but he strongly disagreed with the terminology of the investigation. He did not consider his actions to be violence. According to the transcript of the interrogation on November 7th, Tanaka explained why he chose Sydney Johnson. For many months, he had observed hundreds of people entering Aokigahara. Most of them, he said, were already half dead. They would come with their shoulders slumped, wearing gray clothes, carrying a desire to disappear, to dissolve into the forest. Tanaka ignored them, letting the forest do its work. But Sydney was different. She became a trigger. "She was too loud for this place," Tanaka commented dryly to the investigator. "Not with sound, but with color. Her yellow jacket burned against the moss. She wanted to live. She came to take the images of the forest to her cell, not to give herself to it. I saw in her an excess of energy that needed to be captured. I had to stop this moment before time and the decay of the forest destroyed its perfection." Sydney Johnson was not an accidental victim of circumstance. She was a victim of her own life force, which, in the eyes of the maniac, required immediate preservation in the form of a red cocoon. On November 12, 2013, Sydney was discharged from the Red Cross Hospital. Physically, her life was out of danger, but the consequences of the 7 days spent in immobility remained with her forever. Doctors warned that full sensation in her fingertips might never be restored due to irreversible damage to her peripheral nerves. The girl's wrists, neck, and ankles were left with deep, scarred stripes, traces of jute ropes that cut into the flesh. These scars formed an eternal pattern, a reminder of the turtle knot that Tanaka had used to restrain her. The Johnson family refused to speak to the press. That evening, they left Narita International Airport on a flight to Seattle. The Crimson Thread case in Japan was closed. Hiroshi Tanaka was declared insane and sent to a specialized closed institution for compulsory treatment, where he still draws complex knot patterns on the walls of his ward. However, the real ending of this story did not take place in the courtroom or in the hospital ward. It happened 3 weeks later, in Sydney's apartment in Seattle. It was a rainy evening in late November. Sydney was sitting in her living room. She was trying to get back to her normal rhythm, but the silence of her apartment now frightened her as much as the silence of the forest. On the table in front of her was a package from the darkroom. These were the pictures from the same memory card that the police had found in the forest and returned to the owner along with the camera. The psychologist advised her to destroy the photos without looking at them, but Sydney, as a photographer, felt the need to see what her camera saw. It was a way to regain control of her own memory. She went through the shots with trembling fingers. Here's the view from the bus window. Here's the entrance to the forest. Here's a macro shot of moss. Beautiful, calm landscapes that now seemed like the setting for hell. She came to a picture taken about an hour before the attack. It was a shot that she thought was unfortunate, a random photo of a forest path bathed in sunlight. She remembered the moment. She had stopped to get a drink of water and simply pressed the shutter release while checking the exposure. Sydney held the image up to the light of her desk lamp and picked up the magnifying glass she used for retouching. Her eyes were drawn to a detail in the background, in the upper left corner of the frame, about 15 feet from the point of view. There, at human height, was a red string tied to a thin maple branch. It was not garbage, it was a knot, a small, neat knot of bright red jute, just like the one that would wrap her entire body in an hour. Sydney froze. A cold, more intense than the one in the cave, stiffened her chest. She realized that at the moment she took the photo, when she was enjoying the silence and beauty of nature, she was already inside the web. Tanaka had not just met her by chance. He was guiding her. This thread was a marker that he left on the route of his potential victims, marking the hunting territory. She looked at this thread through the lens. focused on it, but did not see a threat. She perceived the death mark as visual noise. Sydney put the photo away. Outside the window, the rain pattered, washing away the marks on the Seattle asphalt. But she knew there were some things that could not be washed away. She had survived. She had escaped the dead forest. But the red thread in the photo was proof that she had always been part of the composition, even before she had taken her first step into the shade of the trees. And somewhere in the back of her mind, just like in the back of the closed ward in Japan, this knot remained unresolved.